Who are you starving for? The question hit the diner like a gunshot. Every fork stopped moving. Every coffee cup froze midair. The old man's hands cracked trembling, wrapped around a napkin full of stolen food, went completely still. He hadn't been caught stealing. He'd been caught loving someone so desperately he forgot how to eat. And the man who caught him wasn't a cop, wasn't a preacher, wasn't a social worker. He was the most feared biker in 3 counties. If this story moves you, subscribe, hit the bell, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Harold Bennett had a system. He'd perfected it over 11 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. Not that he was counting, though. Of course he was counting the way a man counts every dollar, every pill, every bite of food when there's never quite enough of any of it. The system went like this. He'd walk into Patty's Roadside diner on Tuesday and Friday mornings exactly when the breakfast crowd thinned and the lunch crowd hadn't arrived yet. He'd sit at the same table second from the window left side because that seat had a slightly broken leg and nobody else wanted it, which meant nobody would bother him. He'd order the cheapest thing that came on a real plate, not a sandwich, not soup, a plate. The ribeye lunch special, which wasn't really ribeye and wasn't really special, but it came with 2 sides and bread, and it cost $7.40, including tax. And Harold knew exactly what $7.40 looked like because he'd counted it from his change jar 3 times before leaving the house. He'd eat slowly, methodically, 1 bite of steak, 1 bite of green beans, 1 bite of bread. He always left the mashed potatoes for last because mashed potatoes were the heaviest, and the heaviest thing went into the napkin. That was the system. Eat half, wrap the rest, leave. Nobody noticed, or so Harold believed. Patty herself, a broad-shouldered woman in her 60s who'd run this diner for 31 years and seen every flavor of human desperation walk through that door, she noticed on day 2. But Patty had a rule about dignity. You didn't strip a man of his dignity just because he was struggling. You let him keep his system. So she started quietly making his portions bigger. Not double, not obviously, just a little more steak than the cook intended. A little extra bread slipped onto the plate with a glance that said, "Don't you dare thank me." Harold noticed. He always put that extra bread in the napkin first. But the man in the corner booth, the one who'd been coming in every Tuesday and Friday for the past 6 weeks, always arriving after Harold and always leaving, after Harold always nursing the same black coffee for 2 solid hours, that man noticed something Patty hadn't quite put together. He noticed the way Harold wrapped the food. Not frantically, not guiltily, not like a man ashamed of what he was doing. Like a man who'd done this 10,000 times. Like a man packing a lunchbox for someone he loved. Like a man whose entire reason for sitting down in the first place was not the eating, but the wrapping. Duke Ryder was not a man given to curiosity about other people's business. He'd spent 38 years building a life that required the opposite, a studied indifference to everything that didn't directly concern him, a wall so thick and so old, he'd forgotten there'd ever been a time before the wall. People feared him, and he preferred it that way. Fear kept things simple. Fear kept people from asking questions he didn't want to answer. Fear kept the past exactly where he'd buried it, which was somewhere deep and dark and miles behind him. He was 6'3", 230 pounds, with hands like sledgehammers, and a face that had been rearranged twice by other men's fists and once by a guardrail on I-90. His leather vest carried patches that made state troopers change lanes. He'd been in rooms where men brought guns and left without them. He'd done things in his youth he didn't discuss and had somehow improbably reached 54 years old in one scarred piece. He had no business watching an old man in a diner. And yet, week 1 he'd noticed the system, week 2 he'd started timing it. Week 3 he'd asked Patty casually, like it didn't matter who's the old guy with the truck. Patty had given him a long look that said she knew exactly what he was doing and wasn't sure she approved. "Harold Bennett," she'd said. "Good man. Hard life." Duke had nodded and gone back to his coffee. Week 4 he'd seen Harold order water with his meal instead of coffee. Not because he didn't want coffee. Duke could see it in the way Harold's eyes tracked the coffee pot when Patty carried it past. He ordered water because water was free and coffee was $2, and those $2 were going into the napkin. That was week 4. Week 5 was when Duke started losing sleep. He couldn't explain it rationally, and Duke Ryder had very little patience for things he couldn't explain rationally, so he pushed it down. The way he pushed everything down and told himself it was none of his business. The old man made his choices. Everybody made their choices. The world was full of people struggling, and you couldn't carry all of them. He'd tried carrying one once. So, he knew how that ended. His younger brother Danny had been 22 years old when Duke last saw him, standing in the doorway of a Roach motel room in Billings, skinny as a wire eyes like something had already left them. Duke had been 29. He'd had money in his pocket, a running bike, and a chapter meeting in 4 hours. He'd told himself Danny was getting better. He'd told himself Danny had people looking out for him. He'd told himself all the things a man tells him off when he doesn't want to turn around and make a hard choice. He didn't turn around. Danny was dead of an overdose 11 days later. Duke had been carrying that weight for 25 years, and it had calcified into something so dense and so permanent that some mornings it felt less like grief and more like just another organ, something he breathed around, something that simply was something he no longer thought of as removable. But watching Harold Bennett wrap half a steak in napkins like he was wrapping a Christmas gift, the weight shifted. Week 6, Tuesday, November. Harold walked in at his usual time, sat at his usual table, ordered his usual plate. But something was wrong from the first minute. Duke could see it in how Harold lowered himself into the chair too carefully, like a man managing pain he wasn't willing to show, in how his jaw was set too tight, in how his hands, when they wrapped around the water glass, had a tremor in them that hadn't been there last Friday. Harold drank the water in 3 long gulps. Then he stared at the empty glass. Then, and this was the moment that cracked something open in Duke Ryder's chest, Harold picked up the glass, again tilted it all the way back and pretended to drink. Just to have something to do with his hands. Just to look like a man who was fine. Duke had seen a lot of things in his life. He'd seen men bleed. He'd seen men beg. He'd seen men reduced to nothing by money and by drugs and by other men's cruelty. He had never seen anything hit him quite the way that empty glass did. He was standing up before he'd made the conscious decision to stand. He crossed the diner in 6 steps. 6 steps that every other person in the room tracked with held breath, because Duke Ryder crossing a room was not a thing people ignored. He stopped at Harold's table. Harold looked up slowly. Not scared. Harold was past scared. He was just tired, and that was somehow worse. Duke said quietly enough that only Harold could hear, "Who are you starving for?" The silence that followed was the loudest thing Duke had heard in years. Harold stared at him. For a full 10 seconds, Harold said nothing. His jaw worked. His hands, those trembling, cracked, hard-working hands, flattened on the table like he was bracing for something. Then he said, "Boy named Eli." And Duke sat down. He didn't ask permission. He just sat, pulled the chair out, settled his massive frame into it, and waited. Because something in Harold's face, something in the exhausted, half-relieved, half-terrified way he'd said that name, told Duke that this man hadn't spoken it out loud to another person in a long time. Harold looked at him for a moment, looked at the patches on the vest, looked at the scarred hands on the table. And then Harold made a decision Duke could actually see happening, a slow internal unlocking, like a door that had been sealed shut, deciding finally that the weather had changed. "My grandson," Harold said, 13 years old. His parents, my daughter and her husband, they were killed on Highway 14. 18 months ago, Semi came across the center line. He said it factually the way men his age said devastating things, because that generation had learned that if you kept your voice steady, the thing couldn't knock you down. Eli didn't have anybody else. So, Duke echoed. "So I took him in." Harold glanced down at the napkin-wrapped food on the table. He didn't try to hide it. Past that now, apparently. "Pension doesn't go far. Sawmill cut it down after my back gave out. Between rent and the boys' school supplies and the electric bill." He stopped. "Food stretches if you're careful." "You eat at home?" Duke asked. Harold met his eyes, didn't answer. Duke understood. Harold didn't eat at home. Harold ate half a plate here twice a week, so there would be enough at the house for the boy. "How long?" Duke said. "Almost a year." Duke kept his face very still, because he had learned long ago that showing what you felt in your face only complicated situations. But something behind his ribs was doing something complicated regardless. "The boy, no." "Lord, no." Harold's voice had a flash of something fierce in it, the first real emotion he'd shown since Duke sat down. "He thinks I eat at work. I make sure of it." He paused. He's got enough weight on him already, that kid. Lost his parents, lost his home, lost everything familiar. He doesn't need to be carrying me on top of it." Duke was quiet for a moment. "Then what's he doing right now while you're here?" "School." Harold checked his watch, an old analog one scratched face-worn leather band. "Gets out at 3. I try to have something hot ready." "From the napkin." It wasn't a question. Harold didn't flinch. From the napkin. Duke looked at the table. He looked at this 71-year-old man with the bad back and the heart that was running on willpower and love for a 13-year-old boy who didn't know his grandfather was going hungry every single day. He said, "Order something else." Harold blinked. "I beg your pardon." "Order something else. Patty." He raised his hand. Patty appeared with the speed of a woman who had been watching this table very closely. "Bring him the full dinner plate and pie and coffee." "Duke," Harold started. "I'm not asking you," Duke said, not unkindly, just clearly. "And I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it because I think you've been making yourself small for so long, you forgot you're allowed to take up space." He held Harold's gaze. "Eat the food, Harold, all of it. I'll figure out the napkin situation separately." Harold stared at him for a long moment. Then something in his face, that tremendous, exhausting dignity, cracked just slightly around the edges. Not broke, just cracked. Just enough to let something else through. "My back hurts," Harold said suddenly, like he hadn't meant to say it. "Every morning I wake up and it takes me 20 minutes to stand up straight. And I can't afford the medication, so I don't take it. And some days," he stopped, pressed his lips together. "Some days I'm not sure how much longer I can keep." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Duke said very quietly, "I know." And the two of them sat there in the silence of the diner, the feared biker and the exhausted old man, while Patty set a full plate of food in front of Harold Bennett for the first time in almost a year. And Harold picked up his fork. And for once, for the first time in 11 months, 3 weeks, and some number of days, he'd stopped counting. He ate the whole thing. That afternoon, Duke rode past Harold's address twice before he made himself stop. He told himself he was just looking. Just checking the situation, that was all. The house was a small rental on Garner Street, one of those old workers' cottages that had been built in the 1940s for mill employees and had been deteriorating ever since without anyone spending the money to stop it. The porch sagged. 2 of the front windows had plastic sheeting where glass should have been held in place with duct tape that was losing its argument with the Montana wind. The gutters were pulling away from the roof line on the left side, and there were shingles missing from the roof that someone had tried to patch with tar paper and hadn't quite finished. It wasn't falling down, but it was tired in the same way Harold was tired, like something that had given everything it had and was now just trying to hold its shape through sheer stubbornness. Duke sat on his bike across the street and looked at it. He thought about Danny. He thought about the door of that motel room in Billings and how he hadn't turned around and what that choice had cost him and what it had cost Danny, and how 25 years of carrying that cost hadn't made it lighter by a single pound. He thought about a 13-year-old boy who'd lost his parents on a highway and was now living in a house with plastic-sheeted windows, going to school in the morning and coming home to whatever Harold could wrap in a diner napkin. He pulled out his phone and made a call. "It's Duke." He paused. "I need you to run a name for me. Property records. Garner Street, house number 47. Find out who owns it, what they're charging for rent, and whether they have filed any paperwork on the current tenant." The man on the other end said he'd call back in an hour. He called back in 40 minutes. What he found out made Duke's jaw tighten until he could feel it in his back teeth. The house at 47 Garner Street was owned by Calvin Crow, a name Duke knew because everybody in Milford County knew that name the way you knew a smell that meant something had gone wrong, somewhere you couldn't quite locate. Calvin Crow owned 11 rental properties in the county. He'd bought them all in the decade after the sawmill downsized, when the workers who'd lived in them were desperate enough to sell cheap and scared enough to keep renting at whatever price he named. He'd never once spent money on repairs. He'd raised the rent every year without exception. And according to county records, he had filed an eviction notice on Harold Bennett, not recently, not as a last resort, 3 weeks ago, scheduled for December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas. Duke sat very still on his motorcycle on a cold Tuesday afternoon in November, reading a text message that told him a 71-year-old man with a bad back and a hungry grandson was going to be put out of his home in 6 weeks. on December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas, because he was $60 behind on rent that had been raised 4 times in 2 years on a house that hadn't seen a repair in 5. $60. Duke had $60 in his jacket pocket right now. He sat there and breathed for a while very deliberately because there was a particular kind of anger that Duke Ryder had learned to be careful with. Not the hot explosive kind that burned out fast, but the cold structural kind that could make a man do things that helped nobody and fix nothing. He'd been down that road. He knew where it went. He needed to think. He needed to be smart about this. His phone buzzed, unknown number. He answered. A young voice said, cautious and a little rough, Are you the guy who was sitting with my grandfather at the diner today? Duke went very still. Who is this, he said, though he already knew. My name's Eli, the boy said. Eli Bennett. I walked past the diner on my way from school. I saw you through the window, sitting with my grandpa. A pause. He was eating real food, like a full plate. I haven't seen him do that in... The voice stopped, recalibrated. I followed the truck home. I asked him who you were. He wouldn't tell me much, but he had your number written on a napkin. Of course he did. Duke had written it down before he left, pressed it into Harold's hand, said, call me if anything comes up. He hadn't expected Harold to pass it to the boy. How'd you get my number? Duke said, though he was beginning to suspect. Grandpa left it on the counter. I had to know. A long pause. He ate the whole plate, didn't he, at the diner? Duke said, yeah. Another pause. Longer this time. When Eli spoke again, his voice had dropped lower, quieter, like he was making sure no one else in the house could hear. He doesn't eat at home, does he? It wasn't a question either. Duke closed his eyes for a second. Son, I'm not trying to make you say something you shouldn't. Eli's voice was doing something complicated, trying to stay controlled, the way a kid tries to stay controlled when they've figured out something terrible and don't know what to do with it. I should have known. He always says he ate before I got home, every night. And his breath caught. I believed him. I just believed him every single time. That's because he's good at it, Duke said, and because he loves you. I know he loves me. The voice was rough now, genuinely rough. That's the whole problem, isn't it? He loves me so much, he forgets to love himself. Duke didn't have anything to say to that. That seemed adequate. So he just said, yeah, that's exactly the problem. Are you going to help him? The question was direct and unadorned, the way a 13-year-old who'd been carrying too much for too long asks a question, no cushioning, no strategy, just the bare face of the thing. Duke said, I'm already trying to figure out how. Another pause. Then Eli said, he doesn't know I work nights. Duke's hand tightened on the phone. Say that again. At Garrison's Grocery, I clean the floors. 11 to 2, 3 nights a week. Cash, so there's no record. The manager, Mr. Lofton, he's not supposed to hire anyone under 16, but Eli stopped. Don't tell my grandpa. He'd stop me. He thinks I'm asleep. Duke sat very quietly on his motorcycle on Garner Street and looked at the house with the plastic-sheeted windows and thought about a 13-year-old boy scrubbing grocery store floors from 11 at night to 2 in the morning, and then getting up and going to school, and a 71-year-old man wrapping half a steak in napkins so there'd be something warm for that same boy when he got home. He thought about the eviction notice filed 3 weeks ago. He thought about December 22nd. He thought about Danny. Eli, Duke said, I need you to do something for me. What? I need you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Go to school. Do your work. Don't tell your grandfather what you know about the eating. Not yet. He paused. Can you trust me with this for a little while? A long silence. I don't know you, Eli said. No, you don't. My grandpa trusted you with 1 meal and a napkin with a phone number. That's accurate. My grandpa's a pretty good judge of people, Eli said. Another pause. Something shifted in his voice, something that was either calculation or courage, and Duke suspected it was both. Okay, I'll trust you. For a little while. Duke said, that's all I'm asking. He ended the call and looked at the house for a long moment. Then he made another call, a different one, to a different kind of man about a different kind of problem. Church meeting, he said when the line picked up. This Friday. Not optional. he paused. "And tell Big Mike to bring his trailer. We're going to need tools." He didn't go home after that. He rode out to the county property office before it closed and requested every document on file for Calvin Crow's 11 properties. The woman at the desk, young, tired clearly at the end of a long day, looked at the stack of files he was requesting and then looked at the man requesting them and made a decision that was probably not by the book, but was definitely by the gut. She copied everything. Rent histories, repair request records, or rather the stunning absence of them, health and safety inspection reports, code violation notices that had been issued and then quietly allowed to expire without follow-up. A pattern clear as a blueprint of a man systematically extracting maximum money from minimum income tenants in properties he allowed to slowly collapse around them. Duke spread the documents out on the table at the chapter clubhouse that evening and stared at them until his eyes burned. Calvin Crow was not breaking any single dramatic law. He was doing something more insidious. He was working every seam and gray area of tenant law in a rural Montana county with a small court system and a housing market that gave poor people nowhere else to go. He was legal, he was technical, he was meticulous. And he was going to put Harold and Eli Bennett on the street on December 22nd. Duke looked at the documents and thought about what kind of man could look at an old man's pension statements, understand that this was a person living on the margin of survival, raise the rent anyway, and then file eviction proceedings over $60 without a single moment of human hesitation. He thought about what kind of man that made Calvin Crow, and then he started making a plan. He worked until midnight. He made calls. He pulled in favors, some from men in leather, some from men in suits, some from men in between. He made a list of every family in Milford County who rented from Calvin Crow. He made another list of every inspector, city council member, and county official who had jurisdiction over residential rental properties. And he wrote in his own handwriting on a yellow legal pad a list of every code violation present at 47 Garner Street, everyone that he could see from the street, and everyone he could infer from the health department records he'd gotten from the county office. By midnight, he had something. Not everything, but something. And as he drove home through the Montana cold, he thought about what Eli had said. He loves me so much he forgets to love himself. He thought about how you could spend your entire life perfecting the art of not needing anyone, not asking for anything, not letting a single person see the machinery behind your walls. And then one day a boy on a phone says 6 words that take the whole structure apart at the foundation. Duke parked his bike, went inside, sat in his kitchen in the dark, and for the first time in 25 years, he thought about Danny without trying to shut the door. He let himself think about the door of that motel room. He let himself think about the choice he'd made. And he said quietly to nobody in particular, not again. Friday came. Harold walked into the diner, sat at his table, ordered his plate. Duke was already there. Harold looked at him across the room and something passed between them, an acknowledgement, a recognition, the particular grammar of two people who have shown each other something true about themselves and are now figuring out what to do with it. Duke got up and walked over, sat down across from him. "How's the back?" he said. Harold smiled a tired, real smile. "Same as yesterday." "Eat the whole plate today, Harold." Harold looked at him with those steady, worn-out eyes. "You going to make a habit of this?" Duke said. "Looks like." Harold shook his head slowly. "You're a strange man, Duke Ryder." "I've been told." "Why?" Harold said. Just that, quietly with genuine curiosity, not suspicious or defensive. Just why? Duke thought about it. About Danny. About the door. About Eli scrubbing floors at midnight. About December 22nd. About a boy who said he loves me so much he forgets to love himself, and an old man who wrapped half a steak in napkins like it was precious cargo. He said, "Because someone should have done it sooner." Harold was quiet for a moment, then he nodded once the way a man nods when he understands something that doesn't need more words. Patty arrived with 2 plates. Duke looked at his. Harold looked at his. They ate. And outside on the parking lot of Patty's Roadside diner, the first snow of the season began to fall on a dying factory town that didn't yet know it was about to wake up. The snow that had started falling on Friday evening didn't stop until Sunday morning, and by the time it did, Milford County was buried under 14 inches of silence. Duke spent that weekend doing 3 things: reading every document he'd copied from the county property office, making phone calls he didn't tell anyone about, and driving past 47 Garner Street more times than he'd ever admit to another living soul. On his third pass Sunday afternoon, he saw Eli for the first time in person. The boy was outside trying to nail a piece of plywood over the sagging section of the front porch before the next round of weather hit. He was using a hammer that was too heavy for him and nails that were the wrong size, and he was doing it with the particular focused stubbornness of someone who has decided that a thing needs doing and has nobody to ask for help. He was smaller than Duke expected thin, in the way kids get thin when they're growing too fast on not enough food, all angles and wrists, but the way he moved, the way he set his jaw, and drove each nail like it had personally offended him, told Duke something important about who this boy was. He didn't stop. He didn't look up. He just kept working. Duke drove past without stopping. Monday morning, he called a man named Gus Farrell, who was a building inspector in Cascade County, and owed Duke a favor from a situation 3 years back that neither of them discussed in polite company. He described in precise detail every visible problem at 47 Garner Street. Gus listened without interrupting. Then Gus said, "That's a rental property." "Yes." "Who's the owner of record?" "Calvin Crow." A pause that was one beat too long. "Duke, you know Crow's got a relationship with 2 members of the county board." "I know exactly what relationships Calvin Crow has," Duke said. "That's not what I asked you." Another pause. Then, "I can't do an official inspection in Cascade from Milford County jurisdiction." "I'm not asking for an official inspection. I'm asking you to look at what I've described and tell me which of those conditions constitute violations of Montana residential code." Gus was quiet for 10 seconds. Then he said, "Send me your notes." Duke sent his notes. By noon, Gus had sent back a list of 11 code violations, 4 of which qualified as habitability issues under Montana law, meaning a landlord could not legally collect rent while those conditions existed unaddressed, which meant if properly documented and filed with the right authority, Calvin Crow's eviction proceeding against Harold Bennett might be not just morally wrong but legally compromised. Duke looked at that list for a long time. Then he called a woman named Sandra Okafor, who was a tenant rights paralegal in Great Falls and had once helped Duke's chapter charity work navigate a housing dispute for a veteran 2 years back. He explained the situation. Sandra asked 3 sharp questions. Then she said, "He filed eviction while those violations were active. According to the county records, the violations predate the filing by at least 8 months. And the tenant, how old? 71, spinal injury, fixed pension, and he's raising a minor child, 13-year-old grandson, both parents deceased." Sandra made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Then she said, "Get me everything, the lease, the rent history, the inspection, records, the eviction filing, everything." She paused. "Duke, if what you're describing is accurate, Crow may have filed a fraudulent eviction. That's not just a civil matter." Duke said, "That's what I was hoping you'd say." He spent the rest of Monday afternoon tracking down Harold's lease agreement, which required a conversation with Harold that Duke was not looking forward to having. He drove to 47 Garner Street at 4:30, right around the time Eli would be getting home from school, and knocked on the door. Harold opened it. He looked at Duke on his porch and then at the truck parked at the curb and then back at Duke. He didn't say anything for a moment. He looked like a man who had been waiting for something and wasn't sure if this was the good version or the bad versions of it. "You better come in," Harold said. The inside of the house was clean. That was the first thing Duke registered. Not the water stain on the ceiling, not the window with the plastic sheeting, not the ancient baseboard heater clicking and struggling in the corner. The clean. Harold Bennett kept an immaculate house with almost nothing in it, the way a man keeps things when he has very little, and understands the value of order when everything else is uncertain. Eli was at the kitchen table doing homework. He looked up when Duke walked in, and something moved across his face, recognition, wariness, and underneath both of those, something that looked uncomfortably like hope. He was a serious-faced kid with Harold's eyes, that same steady, watchful quality, like he'd learned early that the world required careful observation. "You're Duke," Eli said, not a question. "And you're Eli." Duke pulled out a chair across from the boy without waiting to be invited. Harold sat down at the head of the table and looked between the two of them with the expression of a man watching 2 weather systems that are about to make contact. "You talked to him," Eli said to Duke. "On the phone." "I did." Eli looked at his grandfather. Harold was very still. Eli said slowly, carefully, like he was laying down a card he'd been holding for a while. "Grandpa, I know you don't eat at home." The kitchen went completely silent. Harold's face did something complicated and painful. He opened his mouth, closed it, looked at Duke with an expression that asked whether this was something Duke had caused, and Duke gave a small shake of his head that said he figured it out himself. Harold closed his eyes for a moment. "Eli." "I'm not mad," Eli said quickly. His voice was controlled in the way that meant he was working very hard to keep it that way. "I'm not. I need you to know that I know, because I've been carrying it and pretending I didn't know, and I can't do that anymore." He stopped. His hands were flat on the table, pressing down. "I work nights, Grandpa, at Garrison's Grocery, 3 nights a week." Harold's eyes opened, and the look on his face, Duke would remember it for years, not just pain, not just surprise. Something that went deeper than both of those things, the look of a man discovering that the person he was sacrificing everything to protect had been quietly sacrificing themselves right alongside him in the dark, without either of them knowing. "Eli," Harold's voice had dropped to almost nothing. "I clean floors," Eli said, 11 to 2. "Mr. Lofton pays cash." He paused. "I was trying to get enough ahead so you wouldn't have to worry about the rent." Harold made a sound that wasn't a word. He pressed his hand over his mouth. Eli said, "How long has it been since you actually ate a full meal?" Harold lowered his hand. He looked at his grandson for a long moment, and the look between them was the kind that doesn't need language because there's too much in it for language to carry. Then he said very quietly, "Almost a year." Eli nodded slowly, like he'd known and needed to hear it anyway. Then Eli turned to Duke. The seriousness in his face hadn't shifted, but something underneath it had sharpened. "Why are you here today?" With a notepad. Duke appreciated directness in a person. He'd always found indirectness a waste of everyone's time. He said, "Because your landlord filed eviction papers 3 weeks ago and plans to remove you from this house on December 22nd. The silence that followed was different from the previous one. This one had weight. Harold had gone very still. "I know about the notice." Duke looked at him. "You know. It came in the mail last month." Harold's jaw was set. "I was handling it." "How?" Duke said. Not aggressively, just directly. Harold was quiet. "Grandpa," Eli said. His voice had shifted into something older than 13-something, tired and determined at once. "How were you handling it?" Harold looked out the window. Then he said, "I was going to talk to Crow, work something out." Duke said carefully, "Harold, Calvin Crow has filed eviction proceedings on 4 tenants in the last 2 years. All of them elderly, all of them fixed income. None of them had the resources to fight it. 2 of them left without any legal challenge at all." He paused. "Crow is not a man who works things out. He's a man who waits for people to give up." Harold turned back from the window and looked at Duke with those tired, steady eyes. "And what am I supposed to do about that? I don't have money for a lawyer. I can barely make rent." "You don't need money for a lawyer," Duke said. "I've been in contact with a tenant, rights paralegal in Great Falls. Sandra Okafor. She's looked at what I've sent her about this property." He put his notepad on the table. "Harold, this house has 4 active habitability violations under Montana Residential Code. Your landlord cannot legally pursue eviction while those violations exist unaddressed. Crow may have filed fraudulently." Harold stared at the notepad. Eli leaned over to look at it. "That's a legal argument," Harold said. "It's the beginning of one. Sandra needs your lease, your rent payment history, and your copy of the eviction notice." Duke looked at him steadily. "I need you to trust me with this." Harold was quiet for a long moment, long enough that Duke could hear the baseboard heater clicking and the wind pushing against the plastic sheeting on the window, and Eli's pencil, which the boy had started tapping against the table without seeming to notice. Then Harold said, "You a lawyer now, Duke? No. You just a man who fixes other people's problems. I'm a man who made a mistake 25 years ago." Duke said, "And I've been looking for something worth doing since then." Harold looked at him. Eli looked at him. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Harold got up, went to the cabinet above the refrigerator, and came back with a manila envelope. He set it on the table. Duke opened it. Inside was the lease, the rent history, every payment, Every increase, every handwritten note Harold had made to himself to document the changes in the eviction notice, folded neatly in thirds. Duke looked at the rent history. In 2 years, Calvin Crowe had raised Harold's rent 5 times, not 4, 5. Each increase was just small enough to be technically within the bounds of his lease terms and just large enough to slowly close the margin Harold had to live on. It was precise. It was calculated. It was the work of a man who understood exactly how much pressure it took to make a person fall. Duke photographed every document with his phone. "I'll get these to Sandra tonight," he said. "Don't open the door for Crowe. Don't respond to any communication from him directly. If he contacts you, you call me." Harold watched him put the phone away. "And if this doesn't work, if the legal argument doesn't hold," Duke said, "then we find another way." "What other way?" Duke looked at him evenly. "Harold, I brought 43 guys to a charity run last spring and we raised $11,000 for a veteran's family in 2 weekends. He paused. "There are ways I can help that don't require a courtroom." Harold studied him for a long moment. Then he looked at Eli. Eli was watching Duke with that careful measuring look that Duke was beginning to understand was just how this kid processed the world slowly, thoroughly, without letting anyone see how much he was taking in. Eli said, "You were watching him at the diner for weeks before you said anything." Duke said, "Yes." "Why'd you wait so long?" It was a good question, an uncomfortably good question from a 13-year-old who probably didn't realize how far it went. Duke said, "Because I wanted to be sure I wasn't going to make a move and then walk away. Once you step into something like this, you're in it. And I had to be sure I was ready to be in it." Eli considered this. Then he nodded once with a gravity that didn't belong to a 13-year-old and somehow fit him perfectly anyway. "Okay," he said, "I believe you." Duke drove straight to his chapter clubhouse and scanned every document and sent them to Sandra. She replied within 40 minutes with 3 more questions and a preliminary opinion that the eviction was, in her words, aggressively challengeable. Duke called her and they talked for an hour. By the time he got off the phone, it was nearly 9. He sat at the table in the clubhouse with a cold cup of coffee and his yellow legal pad and started writing. Not legal arguments, not logistics. He wrote down everything Harold had told him in order from the first conversation at the diner. He wrote down what Eli had told him on the phone. He wrote down the rent history, the code violations, the 5 rent increases the eviction filed on a man who was $60 behind because the rent had been raised 5 times in 2 years on a house with broken windows and no working heat in 2 of the rooms. He sat back and looked at what he'd written. Then he picked up his phone and called a man named Reeves. Reeves was a retired journalist who'd spent 20 years covering county government for the Great Falls Tribune and now ran a local online news operation that people in Milford County read more than they admitted to. He and Duke had a strange, respectful relationship built on the mutual understanding that they were both in their own ways interested in the same thing, what actually happened versus what people said happened. Duke said, "I've got a story for you." Reeves said, "Duke Ryder calling me about a story. This is either very good or very bad." "Calvin Crowe," Duke said, a pause. "That's interesting. I've got rent records code violations and eviction notice filed, while the property had active habitability violations and a tenant who's a 71-year-old man raising his orphaned 13-year-old grandson on a fixed pension." He paused. "Crowe raised his rent 5 times in 2 years. He's trying to put them out of that house 3 days before Christmas." Reeves was quiet for a moment. "You have documentation?" "Everything." "Can the tenant speak to a reporter?" Duke thought about Harold's face when he'd said I was handling it, about the manila envelope kept in the cabinet above the refrigerator, organized and documented, because Harold Bennett was a man who kept his affairs in order even when his affairs were falling apart. "I'll ask him," Duke said. "He's a private man, but I think when he understands what's at stake, I think he'll talk." Reeves said, "Duke, how deep does this go? Is it just Crowe or—" "I've got files on 11 properties," Duke said. "All Crowe, all the same pattern. Harold's not the first." The silence on Reeves's end had a particular quality, the silence of a man who'd been waiting for a thread to pull and has just been handed the end of it. "Send me what you've got," Reeves said, "tomorrow after I talk to Harold." Duke put down the phone and looked at his legal pad again. He thought about something Eli had said on the kitchen. Not the part about the floors, not the part about the rent. The first thing, the way he'd said it when Harold had confirmed it had been almost a year, he'd nodded slowly. Like he'd known, like some part of him had calculated it and arrived at approximately 12 months and had been living with that number quietly by himself until someone gave him permission to put it into the room. Duke thought about being 13 years old and doing that kind of math in your head every night and still getting up every morning and going to school. He thought about scrubbing floors from 11 to 2. He thought about the boy outside with the hammer and the wrong size nails fixing a porch that his landlord was supposed to fix in the snow alone because somebody had to. He picked up his phone one more time, called Big Mike. Big Mike was 6'5", 300 pounds, permanently cheerful, and could fix virtually anything that was structurally wrong with a building because he'd spent 20 years in construction before a back injury put him on his bike full time. Duke said, "How are you on roofing?" Big Mike said. "Pretty solid. Why, Garner Street, number 47. The roof's got missing shingles and the gutters are separating." "Duke, it's 30 degrees out and there's—" "I know what the weather is, Mike." A pause. Then in a different tone, "How bad is the situation?" Duke told him. "Not everything. Enough." Big Mike was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who else are we bringing?" Duke said, "That's what Friday's church meeting is for." He put down the phone, looked at the ceiling, and let himself feel just for a moment the particular sensation of something that had been locked for a very long time, starting slowly to move. He thought about Danny one more time, not with the usual crushing weight, just with a kind of clear, sad recognition. He couldn't go back. He couldn't fix what he'd failed to do in a doorway in Billings 25 years ago. But there was a boy on Garner Street scrubbing floors in the middle of the night for a grandfather who was going hungry to keep him fed. And there was a chapter full of men who understood better than most what it meant to be the kind of person other people crossed the street to avoid, while somebody somewhere needed exactly what you had to give. Duke turned off the light in the clubhouse, walked out to his bike, and sat on it for a moment in the cold. He thought, this is not going to be simple. He thought Crow is not going to fold without a fight. He thought Harold is too proud and Eli is too young, and the whole situation is one missed payment or one bad doctor visit away from collapsing. Then he started the engine. Because the thing Duke Ryder had learned the hard way, the expensive way, the way that cost you a brother, was that simple wasn't the point. The point was whether you turned around when you still had time to matter. This time he was turning around. Sandra Okafor called Duke on Wednesday morning at 7:42, which meant she'd been working on it since before dawn, which meant she'd found something. "The eviction is invalid," she said without preamble. "I'm filing a motion to dismiss today. Crow's attorney is going to push back, but the habitability violations are documented. They predate the filing by 8 months, and Harold's rent payment record is actually remarkably clean given his circumstances. He's missed one partial payment in 2 years. One." She paused. "Duke, this man kept meticulous records. Every payment, every rent increase, notice, every piece of correspondence dated, organized, filed. He's that kind of man," Duke said. "Well, that kind of man just gave us a very strong case. The question is timeline. Even with a motion to dismiss, we're dealing with a rural county court that moves slowly. I can't guarantee we stop the December 22nd date through legal channels alone. How long do you need?" 3 weeks minimum to get a hearing scheduled, ideally 4. "That puts us right at the wire." "Yes," Sandra said, "it does." Duke thanked her, put down the phone, and called Reeves. Reeves had been busy. He'd spent Tuesday pulling property tax records, court filings, and rental histories on all 11 of Crow's properties, and what he'd assembled was not just a story about one eviction. It was a pattern, systematic, deliberate. 8 of Crow's 11 tenants were over 60, 6 were on fixed income. In the past 3 years, he'd filed eviction proceedings 7 times. 5 of those tenants had left without fighting. The 2 who'd stayed had paid whatever Crow demanded because they didn't know they had options. "This is bigger than Harold," Reeves said. "I know. Duke, if I run this story, Crow's going to come at whoever gave me the information." "Run it," Duke said. "I'll handle Crow." Reeves was quiet for a second. "Is that a metaphor or a literal statement?" "It's whichever one keeps me out of legal trouble," Duke said. "Run the story, Reeves. People deserve to know." The story ran Thursday morning on Reeves's site with the headline, "Milford County Landlord Faces Mounting Code Violations as Elderly Tenant Eviction Looms." It was clean-sourced and devastating. It named Crow by name. It quoted the habitability violations. It described Harold's situation without identifying him by name. Reeves had agreed to that condition, but it described the circumstances in enough detail that anyone who knew Harold would recognize them immediately. By noon, it had been shared 400 times. By 3 o'clock, over 1,000. By 5 o'clock, Calvin Crow's attorney had called Sandra Okafor's office and left a message using language Sandra described to Duke as aggressively unprofessional. Duke took that as a good sign. Friday came and the chapter met. Duke had been to 1,000 chapter meetings. He'd sat in that room for decisions large and small, for logistics and disputes and the ordinary business of men who chose to move through the world as a unit. But he hadn't been to a meeting quite like this one because he hadn't walked into that room with something personal on the table in a very long time. He told them about Harold. He told them about Eli. He told them about the rent history and the eviction and the code violations and the roof line with the missing shingles and the window with the plastic sheeting and the baseboard heater that couldn't keep a room above 55 degrees when the wind came from the north. He told them about the napkins, about the diner, about the half a plate of food wrapped like it was precious cargo, because to Harold Bennett, it was because it was dinner for a 13-year-old boy who'd lost everything except his grandfather. He told them about Eli scrubbing floors at midnight. The room was quiet when he finished. Not uncomfortable quiet, the kind of quiet that meant people were sitting with something that had gotten under their skin and were deciding what to do about it. Big Mike said, "What do we need?" Duke said, 2 days, maybe 3, all the tools you've got. Roofing materials, I'll get a list from Gus on what's needed. Electrical, the panel in that house is from 1987, and 2 of the breakers are non-functional. Plumbing's got a slow leak under the kitchen sink that's been there long enough to warp the subfloor. He looked around the room. And groceries, that house needs to be full. Nobody argued. Nobody asked why. Nobody made a speech about whether this was their business or what it had to do with them. Crow, who was 58 and had hands like mechanical equipment and had once rebuilt a motorcycle engine in a parking lot in the rain, said, "I can do the electrical." A man called Shepard, who hadn't been inside a church since 1994, but had a gift for carpentry that bordered on the spiritual, said, "I'll take the subfloor." Big Mike said, "Roofing's mine." And just like that, it was organized. Not because Duke told them to, because they understood the way men understand things when they've chosen to live by a code that's tougher and simpler than the one the rest of the world uses, that some things don't require a reason beyond the fact that they're right. Duke said, "One more thing. Crow's gonna find out we're involved. He's already rattled from the story Reeves ran. He's going to push back somehow legally through the court through whatever pressure he can apply." He looked at the room steadily. "I need everyone here to be clean. No confrontations. No situations. Whatever he throws, we handle it through Sandra and through Reeves." "Are we clear?" Murmurs of agreement. "Are we clear?" Duke said again a little harder. "Clear," said the room. Duke nodded. Saturday morning, 6 a.m. Garner Street. He hadn't told Harold yet. That conversation happened Friday evening, and it went approximately the way Duke expected it to go, which was difficult. Harold opened the door, saw Duke's face, and immediately said, "What did you do?" "I haven't done it yet," Duke said. "That's why I'm here." He explained the plan. Harold listened with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression Duke was beginning to recognize as Harold's version of emotional armor, the posture of a man who spent his whole life handling things himself and found outside help almost physically uncomfortable. When Duke finished, Harold said, "I don't need charity." "I know you don't need it," Duke said. "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" "The point is your house has 4 habitability violations, and your landlord is in legal trouble for filing a fraudulent eviction, and if we fix those violations with documented work orders and material receipts, it strengthens Sandra's case and weakens Crow's position." Duke paused. "I'm not doing it because you need charity. I'm doing it because it's tactically correct and because I want to." Harold looked at him for a long moment. "How many men?" 43 available. Probably 30 who'll show." Harold's expression shifted something that wasn't quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. 30 bikers on Garner Street on a Saturday morning. My neighbors are going to lose their minds." "Probably," Duke said. Harold was quiet for a moment. "Then Eli can't know it's charity." "He won't," Duke said. I'll tell him we're doing it because it's legal documentation for the court case, which is true. Harold studied him. Is that the whole truth? Duke said, the whole truth is that your grandson reminded me of someone I lost a long time ago, and I am not losing another one. But that's my reason, not his business. He looked at Harold steadily. You going to let us help or not? Harold unfolded his arms. A long exhale. 6 in the morning is early. Yes. I'll make coffee, Harold said. Saturday at 6:15:31, motorcycles rolled down Garner Street in the dark before sunrise, engines cutting to idle one by one as they parked. Harold stood on the porch with 2 thermoses of coffee and an expression that was doing complicated things with itself. Eli stood beside him, and when he saw the line of bikes stretching down the block, he said nothing for a full 10 seconds. Then he said quietly, they all came for us. Harold put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Don't get sentimental, he said. They're here to work. And they worked. They worked with the focused, organized efficiency of men who were good at things and knew it. Big Mike and 3 others were on the roof within 20 minutes. Crow had the electrical panel open by 6:45. Shepard was under the kitchen sink before the coffee was gone. Duke coordinated between teams moving through the house with his notepad photographing everything before and after materials used work performed, because every photograph and every receipt was documentation that would go into Sandra's filing. Eli worked alongside them. Duke noticed this immediately. The boy didn't watch from the doorway, didn't stay out of the way, didn't treat the situation like something happening to him. He picked up a broom and started clearing debris from where Shepard was working. He held boards when Big Mike needed a second set of hands. He ran to the hardware store twice on foot when they needed additional materials, moving at a near run, each way back within 20 minutes both times. Around 9 o'clock, Duke found him in the kitchen holding a piece of warped subfloor that Shepard had just pried up, examining it with intense concentration. You know what caused this, Duke said. Slow leak, Eli said. Under the sink, probably been going on for a couple years. The landlord was supposed to fix it. He looked at the damaged wood. My grandpa reported it in writing 8 months ago. Crow's property manager sent a guy out who looked at it and left without doing anything. Grandpa sent a second letter. Nothing. Duke looked at him. How do you know about the letters? Eli met his eyes. Because I helped him write them. His handwriting's not great anymore, the arthritis. He paused. I type better than I write, so I'd type what he wanted to say. He'd sign it. We'd mail it certified. He held up the warped wood. This is what happened to the letters. Duke felt something move in his chest, that same shifting he'd felt in the diner watching Harold pretend to drink from an empty glass. He said, you kept copies. Eli blinked. Of course I kept copies. Where my school Google Drive scanned them. He looked slightly puzzled by the question, the way people look when they have done something that seems obvious to them. Why, Mao? Duke said slowly, Eli, those copies are evidence. They prove Crow received notice of the habitability issues and failed to act. Combined with the habitability violations in the eviction filing, those copies could be the difference between Sandra's case holding and it not holding. Eli stared at him. Then something moved in his expression, a kind of startled realization, the look of a person who's been carrying something and suddenly understands it was more valuable than they knew. I'll send them to you, he said, right now. He pulled out his phone, an old model cracked screen held together with a rubber band on one corner, and sent Duke a Google Drive link with trembling speed. Duke opened it on his phone. There were 11 documents. Every letter Harold had sent to Crow's property management company, dated with certified mail tracking numbers. Methodical, organized, meticulous, Harold's word, Sandra's word, the word that described this old man's entire approach to a system that had been trying to grind him down for 2 years. Duke forwarded everything to Sandra with a message that said, found the missing piece. Call me. Sandra called him in 6 minutes. He could hear in her voice what she thought of the letters before she said a word. When she did speak, she said, Duke, these letters establish constructive notice with certified mail confirmation. Crow's attorney is going to have a very bad week. A pause. Where did you get these? The 13-year-old, Duke said, a beat of silence. Of course, Sandra said. Of course it was the kid. The work continued through the day. By noon, the roof was sealed. By 2 o'clock, the electrical panel was updated and both non-functional breakers were replaced. By 4, Shepard had replaced the subfloor and rehung the cabinet under the sink and fixed the leak that had been slowly destroying the kitchen floor for 2 years. Big Mike had reseated the gutters and repointed the mortar on the chimney. Crow had replaced the plastic sheeting on the window with actual glass sourced from a salvage yard he knew and installed with professional precision. The house was not transformed. It was still old, still worn, still carrying the weight of decades. But it was sound. It was sealed against the Montana winter in a way it hadn't been in years. And every piece of work was photographed and documented and time-stamped and would be in Sandra Okafor's filing by Monday morning. Around 5 o'clock, when the light was going and most of the work was done, Duke found Harold sitting alone in the kitchen. The house was full of noisemen finishing up cleaning tools, hauling material scraps out, but Harold had found a pocket of quiet in the middle of it and was just sitting, looking at his hands. Duke sat across from him. Harold said, without looking up, "The last time this many people were in this house was when my daughter was alive. She used to have people over. Fill the place up." He paused. After she died, it got very quiet. Duke said nothing. He let it sit. Harold looked up. His eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible. "I called her Sarah," he said, "Eli's mother. She had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's stubbornness." A pause. "She would have liked you," Duke said. "She raised a good boy." Harold nodded slowly. "She did." He looked toward the sound of Eli's voice from the other room. The boy was talking to Big Mike about something animated and gesturing, and Big Mike was laughing in that booming way he had that filled a room. "He's going to be okay, isn't he?" It wasn't quite a question. It was the kind of thing you say when you need to hear it confirmed by someone outside your own head. Duke said, "He's already okay. He's more than okay." He looked at Harold directly. "But so are you. You need to stop acting like your job is only to survive until he doesn't need you anymore." Harold flinched slightly. "Duke, I mean it. You're not a placeholder, Harold. You're not just keeping the seat warm until the boy grows up. You matter. Not to the legal case. Not to the housing situation. To him." Duke paused. "He talks about you like you hung the moon. You know that." Harold pressed out his lips together. "He built a file," Duke said, 11 documents, dated, certified, organized. He built it alongside you and kept it on his school account in case you ever needed it. He wasn't just helping you write letters. He was protecting you, the way you protect him." Duke leaned forward slightly. "That's not a kid keeping the seat warm. That's a kid who loves his grandfather and doesn't know what he'd do without him." Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "My back's been worse lately." Duke went still. "I didn't tell Eli. I didn't tell anyone." Harold's voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a man who has decided something is necessary to say and is managing the saying of it. "There's pain when I breathe sometimes. On the left side," he paused. "I know what that might mean. I've been not knowing on purpose because I can't afford to know and I can't afford to be sick. Not right now. Not with everything." "Harold," Duke said. "Stop." Harold stopped. "When did it start? 6 weeks ago?" "Has it gotten worse?" A pause that was 3 seconds too long. "Yes." Duke looked at him. Harold looked back. Neither of them said what they were both thinking because saying it made it real, and Harold wasn't ready for it to be real. And Duke understood that, but he also understood that 6 weeks of chest pain radiating to the left side in a 71-year-old man was not something you managed by not knowing. Duke said, "Monday morning, I'm taking you to see a doctor." "I know you don't have insurance," Duke said. "I know you can't afford it. I'm not asking you whether you can afford it. I'm telling you that on Monday morning, I'm picking you up at 7, and we're going to the county health center, and you're going to let someone look at you." He held Harold's gaze. "Because Eli scrubs floors at midnight for you. The least you can do is see a doctor." Harold looked at him for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. From the other room, there was a crash, followed immediately by Eli's voice saying, "I'm okay, it's fine, nothing broke." And Big Mike's laughter rolling like thunder through the small house. And Harold, despite everything, despite the left side pain and the 6 weeks of not knowing and the weight of it all, Harold smiled. And it was the most unguarded thing Duke had seen on his face since they'd met. Duke let out a breath. Because he needed Harold to be okay. He needed this stubborn, meticulous, self-sacrificing old man to be okay, not just for Eli, not just for the legal case, not just for some abstract sense of justice. He needed it for the same reason he'd stopped on Garner Street 3 times last week, just to see the lights on in the house. Because you couldn't choose your family, but sometimes if you were paying attention, the world handed you one anyway. And outside on Garner Street, 31 motorcycles sat in a line as the sun went down over Milford County, and the house at number 47 was sealed and warm and full of light and noise for the first time in a very long time. And Calvin Crowe, sitting in his office across town, had just received a certified letter from the offices of Sandra Okafor, attorney and paralegal services, Great Falls, Montana, informing him that his eviction proceeding was being challenged on grounds of habitability, violation, and fraudulent filing, supported by 11 certified mail documents he'd apparently forgotten existed. He read it twice. Then he picked up the phone and called his attorney. And his attorney said very carefully, "Calvin, we have a problem." Calvin Crowe's attorney was a man named Philip Garrett, and Philip Garrett had been handling difficult clients for 22 years, which meant he had a very precise internal alarm system for when a situation was about to become significantly more expensive than anticipated. That alarm was ringing loudly on Sunday evening when he finished reading Sandra Okafor's filing for the third time. He called Crowe back at 8:15. "The certified mail records are the problem," Garrett said. "You received written notice of habitability issues 8 months before you filed the eviction. That's documented, that's time-stamped, and if they can show the conditions still existed at time of filing, which based on what you've described about the property, the eviction is not just challengeable, Calvin, it's potentially fraudulent." "Potentially," Crowe said. "As in potentially criminal. As in potentially the kind of thing that gets referred to the county attorney's office." Garrett paused. "I need to know something, and I need you to be honest with me. Are there other tenants, other properties where you followed this same pattern?" The silence on Crowe's end lasted 4 seconds too long. Garrett said, "Calvin, there may be similar situations on other properties," Crowe said carefully. Garrett closed his eyes. "How many?" Another pause. "Several. Define several." 4, maybe 5. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said in the measured tone of a professional delivering news that is going to cost someone a great deal of money. "Here is what I need you to understand. Right now, this is a civil matter. Sandra Okafor is a competent paralegal who has filed a solid motion. If you push back aggressively, if you try to accelerate the eviction, if you do anything that looks like intimidation of the tenant or his representatives, this stops being a civil matter. And the moment a reporter with documented evidence of a pattern across multiple properties walks into the county attorney's office, this stops being my area of practice." He let that land. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" Crowe said, "I understand." "Good, then here's my advice. Do nothing. Don't contact the tenant. Don't contact the biker. Don't call anyone at the county offices. Let me handle the response to Okafor's filing, and let's see if we can resolve this quietly." He hung up. Crowe sat in his office and looked at the wall. Then he picked up a different phone and made a call that Philip Garrett had specifically told him not to make. Duke got the call from Harold at 6:47 Monday morning, 40 minutes before he was scheduled to pick him up for the county health center. Harold's voice was very controlled. "Someone came to the house last night, late, after Eli was in bed, knocked on the door. Man I didn't recognize. He said he was from Crowe's property management company. Said they were prepared to offer a 60-day extension on the eviction if I agreed to drop the legal challenge and sign a new lease at the current rent." Duke was already pulling on his jacket. "What did you say?" "I said I needed to think about it." A pause. "Duke's 60 days takes us to late February. That's past the worst of winter. That's all." "Harold, stop." Duke's voice was calm but firm. "That offer is a trap. If you drop the legal challenge, Sandra's filing disappears. The habitability violations go undocumented. Crowe's legal exposure goes away. And in 60 days, nothing stops him from filing again." Harold was quiet. "He sent someone to your door at night," Duke said. "That's pressure. That's intimidation. And it's exactly what Garrett told him not to do, which means Crowe is scared enough to stop listening to his own attorney." He paused. "That's good news, Harold. Scared people make mistakes." "I know that," Harold said quietly. I told him no. I told the man I needed to think about it, and when he left, I called you. He paused again. I just wanted you to know it happened. Duke let out a breath. You did the right thing. Did the man give a name? Said his name was Terry. Didn't give a last name. What time did he leave? Around 10:30. Okay, I'm sending Reeves a text right now, and then I'm coming to pick you up and we're going to the health center and you're going to tell the doctor everything you told me about the chest pain. All of it, including how long it's been. Harold said, you're very bossy for someone I just met. 3 weeks, Duke said. I've known you 3 weeks. Like I said, despite everything, Duke almost smiled. I'll be there in 40 minutes. He texted Reeves first. Then he called Sandra and told her about the late-night visit. Sandra's response was immediate and sharp. That's witness tampering adjacent to an active legal proceeding. I want a written statement from Harold describing the visit. The time and exactly what was said. Today. I'll get it, Duke said. The county health center smelled like industrial cleaner and old coffee, and Harold walked into it with the particular rigidity of a man entering a place he has been avoiding on purpose. Duke sat with him through the intake paperwork, which took 40 minutes, because Harold's insurance situation was complicated in the way that things get complicated when you are 71 years old with a spinal injury and a fixed pension, and you have been quietly making do without coverage because the premiums would have taken food off the table. The intake nurse, a practical, quick-moving woman named Carol, who had clearly heard every version of every financial hardship story and responded to all of them with the same brisk efficiency, took one look at Harold's income documentation and said, you qualify for the county senior health assistance program. We're going to get you enrolled today. That covers primary care and specialist referrals. Harold looked at her. I didn't know that program existed. Carol said, most people don't until they need it. She said it without judgment. She handed him a form. Fill this out and we'll get the doctor in to see you. Duke watched Harold fill out the form, watched his hands, the arthritis, the slight tremor, the same hands that had wrapped food in napkins and written certified letters and built a file of documentation that might save his home. He thought about how many systems this man had fallen through, how many programs he'd qualified for without knowing, how many forms he hadn't known to ask for. The doctor was a young man named Alvarez, who listened to Harold's heart for a long time without saying anything, asked very precise questions about the chest pain, the duration, the character of it, and then sent Harold for an immediate EKG and blood work. Duke sat in the waiting room and looked at his phone without seeing it for 45 minutes. When Harold came back out, his face was carefully neutral in the way it got when he was managing something large. Duke said, what did they find? Harold sat down beside him. Irregular rhythm. They're calling it arrhythmia. The doctor says it's been going on for a while, probably longer than 6 weeks. I just didn't notice it until the pain started. He paused. He wants me to see a cardiologist. He wrote a referral. Today. He looked at Duke with those steady eyes. It's manageable, he said, with the right medication and monitoring. It's not the worst thing. But it's not nothing, Duke said. No, Harold said. It's not nothing. Duke said, okay. He stood up. Come on, cardiologist is in the same building. Harold looked up at him. You knew. I asked Carol to find out if there was a cardiologist on site when you went back for the EKG. Duke looked at him steadily. I had a feeling. Harold studied him for a moment. Then he got up with that careful, pain-managing slowness that Duke had stopped wincing at because wincing didn't help. You know, Harold said, most people, when they get involved in someone else's trouble, they do the visible part. Fix the roof, make the calls, then they go home. Yes, Duke said, you're still here. Yes. Harold was quiet for a moment. Then why? Duke thought about the honest answer. He'd been turning it over in his mind for 3 weeks, looking at it from different angles, trying to locate whether it was about guilt or atonement or something more straightforward than either of those. And he kept arriving at the same place. He said, because you reminded me what it looks like when someone does everything right and still loses. And I decided I wasn't going to let that be the end of your story. Harold looked at him for a long moment. Then he said simply, thank you. They sat with the cardiologist for an hour. By the time they left, Harold had a treatment plan, a prescription for 2 medications covered under the Senior Assistance Program, and a follow-up appointment in 3 weeks. The cardiologist, a compact, serious woman who spoke precisely and made Harold feel Duke could see like someone whose health was worth taking seriously, told Harold that with consistent medication and stress reduction, his prognosis was genuinely good. Stress reduction, Harold repeated with the tone of a man being told to flap his arms and flap the eye. The cardiologist said without missing a beat, "I understand you have some housing instability at the moment." "You could call it that," Harold said. "Resolve it," she said. "It's a medical directive." Duke looked at Harold. Harold looked at Duke. Something passed between them that was almost humor. Almost. Because there was still December 22nd. Still Crow's attorney. Still a court hearing that Sandra needed 3 weeks to prepare for. Still a calendar that was not moving in their favor. They were in the truck on the way back to Garner Street when Duke's phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. He answered anyway. A woman's voice said, "Is this Duke Ryder? I read the article in the Milford County News about the landlord and the elderly tenant." Her voice was careful, slightly nervous. "My name is Ruth Hendricks. I'm 73 years old. I rent a property on Meridian Road from Calvin Crow." Duke's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "I'm listening, Ruth." "He filed eviction papers on me in October," she said. "I paid everything he asked. I never missed a full payment. But my heat's been broken since September, and he won't fix it, and I don't know what to do. I called a lawyer once and they said they couldn't take the case." She paused. "The article said there might be someone helping people in my situation." Duke said, "There is. Her name is Sandra Okafor. I'm going to give you her number right now, and I need you to call her today." "Can you do that?" A breath of relief that was almost painful to hear. Yes, I can do that." "Ruth, does Crow know you've been trying to reach people about this?" A pause. "He sent a man to talk to me last week. Told me I should be careful about spreading rumors about my landlord." Duke went very still. Harold, watching his face from the passenger seat, said quietly, "What is it?" Duke held up one finger. To Ruth, he said, "Did you document this visit? Do you remember the date and time?" "I wrote it in my calendar," Ruth said. "I always write things down." "Good. That's very good, Ruth. Call Sandra, tell her exactly what you told me, and tell her about the visit. Date, time, what was said." He paused. "You're not alone in this. Do you understand me?" A long silence, then, "I think I'm starting to." He ended the call. Harold said another one. "Meridian Road, Ruth Hendricks, 73. Duke set his phone in his lap. "He sent someone to her, too. Same week he sent someone to you." He looked at Harold. "This is a pattern, Harold. It's not opportunistic. It's a system. He runs it the same way on every property, every tenant. And he sends people when he's scared." Harold said slowly, "How many of us are there?" "I'm going to find out," Duke said. He picked up his phone and called Reeves. "The story needs a second part," he said when Reeves answered. "There's another tenant, and I think there are more." Reeves said, "How many more?" "Potentially 5 additional properties with the same pattern. I want to find them before Crow does." Reeves said, "I can make some calls." "Do it fast," Duke said. "We don't have a lot of time." By Tuesday evening, Reeves had found 3 more tenants in situations similar to Harold's. All elderly, all fixed income, all on Crow properties with documented repair requests that had gone unanswered, 2 of them with eviction notices filed in the past 6 months. He'd spoken to all 3 on the phone. All 3 were frightened. 2 of them had received visits from men they didn't recognize in the past 2 weeks. Duke passed everything to Sandra. Sandra called him Wednesday morning. Her voice had changed. It was still controlled, still precise, but underneath it was something that sounded like a woman who has been doing tenant advocacy work for a decade and has just seen the full shape of something she'd been looking at pieces of for years. "Duke, if all 4 of these cases are as documented as Harold's, we're not looking at a civil motion anymore. We're looking at a pattern of predatory eviction, tenant harassment, and potentially fraudulent legal filings across multiple properties. This needs to go to the county attorney's office." "Will they take it?" "With 4 cases, documented correspondence, certified mail records, and multiple witnesses to improper tenant contact during active proceedings." Sandra paused. "Yes, I think they will." Duke said, "How long?" "I need to prepare the submission. 3 days, maybe 4. That gives us until Saturday at the latest before Crow's attorney gets wind of it and tries to move first." "I know," Sandra said. "I'll work fast." Duke spent Wednesday and Thursday helping Sandra coordinate. He drove to Ruth Hendricks on Wednesday afternoon and sat at her kitchen table while she told him everything in the broken heat, the repair requests, the rent increases, the visit from the man who'd told her to be careful. She had, like Harold, kept meticulous records. Like Harold, she documented everything in the quiet, organized way of a person who understood that when you have no power, you make the best weapon you can out of evidence. She handed Duke a folder. Inside were copies of every letter, every money order receipt, every date and dollar amount, going back 4 years. Duke looked at the folder. He thought about Harold's manila envelope, about Eli's Google Drive, about Ruth's calendar with the visitor's date written in careful handwriting. He thought about how many people had been quietly building their own cases alone without knowing that anyone was looking. He said, "Ruth, has anyone thanked you for keeping these records?" She looked slightly confused by the question. "No, why would they?" "Because you've just helped protect yourself and at least 4 other people," Duke said. Ruth looked at the folder for a moment. Then she said, "I just wrote things down. Anyone would do that." "No," Duke said very quietly. "They don't, but you did." He got back in the truck and drove. He didn't go home. He drove to Garner Street and parked outside number 47 and looked at the house, sealed now, sound lights on in the kitchen window. He could see Harold's silhouette at the kitchen table. He could see Eli moving past the window, that quick, purposeful movement the boy had, always going somewhere, always doing something. His phone buzzed. A text from Reeves. It said, "Stories ready, 4 tenants, full documentation. I'm running it tomorrow morning. Duke, this is going to break big." Duke stared at the text. He thought about Crow reading it, about Garrett reading it, about the county attorney's office reading it, about the 2 members of the county board who Reeves had mentioned quietly, carefully, had a relationship with Crow that probably needed examining in its own right. He thought about December 22nd, about how much could change in a week and a half if the right things happened in the right order. He texted back, "Run it." He was about to put the phone down when it rang again. This time it was Sandra. Her voice was tight in a way he hadn't heard before. "Duke, I just got a call from Garrett at Crow's attorney. He says his client wants to talk, not through attorneys, directly. He's requesting a meeting with you." Duke went very still. "With me," he said. He said, and I'm quoting, "Tell the biker we should discuss this like reasonable men before it gets out of hand." Sandra's voice was controlled, but barely. "Duke, you do not have to meet with him. In fact, I'd advise against it." Duke looked at the house at 47 Garner Street. At the sealed roof Big Mike had fixed. At the window Crow had replaced. At the light in the kitchen, where a 71-year-old man with an arrhythmia and a bad back was probably drinking decaf and trying to read because his cardiologist had told him stress reduction was a medical directive. He thought about Ruth Hendricks' folder. He thought about 4 more families. He thought about December 22nd. He said, "Set the meeting." Sandra said, "Duke, I'm not going to do anything to compromise the case," he said. "I just want to look him in the face." A pause, then Sandra said carefully, "What are you going to say to him?" Duke thought for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to give him one chance to do the right thing, because everyone deserves one chance." He paused. "And then, if he doesn't take it, he's going to find out what happens when 43 men who spent their lives being underestimated decide someone needs to be held accountable." Sandra was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Friday, noon, his office." Duke said, "I'll be there." He put the phone down and looked at the house one more time. The light in the kitchen was warm and steady. Harold was still at the table. Eli had stopped moving past the window and was sitting now. Duke could see the shape of him still at the table beside his grandfather. 2 people in a warm kitchen, a sealed roof over their heads, a cardiologist with a treatment plan, 11 letters in a Google Drive. And Friday at noon, Duke Ryder was going to walk into Calvin Crow's office, and one of 2 things was going to happen. Either Crow was going to do the right thing, or he was going to find out very directly that he had badly miscalculated who he was dealing with. Calvin Crow's office was on the 2nd floor of a building he owned on Main Street, which meant he could look down at Milford County from a window and feel Duke imagine like a man in control of the geography. Duke had been in rooms like this before, rooms designed to make you feel smaller than you were, with the heavy desk and the framed credentials and the particular silence of a space where money lived. He'd learned a long time ago that the way to handle a room like that was to walk in like you owned it. So that's what he did. Crow was already seated when Duke arrived. He was 61, thick through the shoulders, with the careful grooming of a man who understood that appearance was a form of argument. He had the eyes Duke had expected, watchful, calculating, the eyes of a man who had spent decades reading people for weakness and acting on what he found. He looked at Duke's vest, at the patches, at the size of him filling the doorway, and something moved behind those eyes that he controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough. Duke sat down without being invited. Crow said, "I appreciate you coming." Duke said, "You wanted to talk. I'm here." A pause. Crow folded his hands on the desk. "I think we've gotten off on the wrong foot. The situation with Mr. Bennett, it became more complicated than it needed to be. I'm prepared to be reasonable." "Define reasonable," Duke said. "Drop the legal challenge. I'll cancel the eviction, reduce the rent to the original amount, and give him a 2-year lease at that rate." Crow spread his hands. "That's generous." Duke looked at him for a moment. "And the other tenants?" A slight tightening around Crow's eyes. "Which other tenants?" "Ruth Hendricks on Meridian Road, the Pattersons on Creek Street, Dorothy Vance on Elm, the Garcias on Route 9. Duke said the names slowly, one at a time, watching Crow's face. "The tenants in your other properties who have broken heat and unaddressed repair requests and eviction filings and visits from men they didn't recognize, telling them to be careful about what they say." He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. "Those tenants." Crow was very still. Duke continued, his voice level and unhurried. "Here's what's going to happen, Calvin. Today, Reeves runs his second story. It names 4 tenants across 4 properties. It has certified mail records, documented repair requests, and multiple witness accounts of improper contact during active legal proceedings. By tomorrow morning, the county attorney's office will have Sandra Okafor's full submission on their desk." He leaned forward slightly. "Your attorney told you not to send those men. You sent them anyway. That's the thing that turns a civil matter into something else entirely." Crow said carefully, "I don't know what you're referring to." "You sent a man named Terry to Harold Bennett's house on Sunday night at 10:30, Duke said. "Harold wrote it down, date, time, description, exact words, because Harold Bennett is a man who writes everything down." He paused. "Just like Ruth Hendricks, just like Dorothy Vance. All these people that you thought were too old and too poor to fight back, they've been documenting everything. For years, because when you have no power, you make a record. And now that record is in Sandra Okafor's files, and it is going to the county attorney, and there is nothing you or Philip Garrett can do to stop that." Crow's hands, still folded on the desk, had tightened. Duke could see the whitening at the knuckles. "So here is the choice," Duke said. "You can fight this. You can spend the next 18 months in county court while Sandra and Reeves in the county attorney's office build a public record of exactly how you've run your properties and treated your tenants. Or," he let the word hang, "you resolve every situation, all 5 properties, every eviction dropped, every repair addressed properly with licensed contractors documented and inspected. Every tenant given a fair lease at a fair rate, and you do it before December 22nd. Crow said, "That's not a negotiation, that's a demand." "Yes," Duke said, "it is." Silence, the kind of silence where you can hear a man calculating, running numbers, weighing exposure, measuring what fighting would cost against what folding would cost. Duke had sat in enough negotiations to know what that silence sounded like. He waited. Then Crow said quietly, "And if I do all of that, the legal challenge goes away." "The legal challenge is Sandra's, not mine. What I can tell you is that if you resolve every one of those situations fully and in good faith, I will tell Sandra and I will tell Reeves, and they will make their own decisions." Duke stood up. "But I'll tell you something else, Calvin, free of charge." He looked at the man across the desk, really looked the way he looked at people when he wanted them to understand he was not performing, not posturing, just speaking plain fact. Those people kept records because they had no other weapon. Harold Bennett wrapped food in napkins for a year so his grandson could eat. Ruth Hendricks sat in a cold house all winter because she was afraid to push back. You built a system that relied on people being too scared and too isolated to fight. He paused. That system is over. Whether you resolve this today or whether you go through 18 months of court and public scrutiny, that system is over. The only question is what it costs you to find that out. He walked to the door. Crow said behind him, "You came here for a boy you'd never met 3 weeks ago." Duke stopped, didn't turn around immediately. Then he did. Crow was looking at him with something in his face that wasn't quite what Duke expected. Not defiance, not calculation. Something almost like genuine bafflement. "Why, what's in it for you?" Duke thought about Danny, about the door in Billings, about 25 years of carrying a weight that didn't get lighter and never would, about a diner booth and an old man and an empty glass and 6 words that had cracked something open. He said, "Nothing's in it for me. That's the part you can't understand." He left. He was halfway down the stairs when his phone buzzed. A text from Reeves Stories Live. "Already 200 shares. County attorney's office just called me for a comment." Duke kept walking. He was in his truck, 2 blocks from Crow's building when Sandra called. "Garrett just called me," she said, and her voice had something in it he'd never heard before, a kind of stunned, barely controlled satisfaction. "He says his client wants to discuss a comprehensive resolution. All 5 properties. He used the words full remediation." Duke was quiet for a moment. "Duke," Sandra said, "I think he's going to fold." "I think so too," Duke said. "Don't let him off cheap. Every repair documented and inspected. Every lease fair and fixed for 2 years minimum. And I want a written commitment on Harold's situation specifically, not just the eviction drop, but the rent roll back to the original amount with a 2-year lock." "I'll get it in writing," Sandra said. "And Duke, the county attorney's office, is going to want to talk to you about the pattern across the properties, the harassment, the intimidation visits." "I'll talk to them," Duke said. "Whatever they need." He drove to Garner Street. Harold opened the door before Duke knocked, which meant he'd heard the truck. He looked at Duke's face and read it the way he'd gotten good at reading it over 3 weeks. The set of the jaw, the steadiness in the eyes that meant something had happened, and it was not the worst version of what could have happened. Harold said, "Tell me." Duke told him. All of it. The meeting with Crow, Sandra's call, Garrett's call, the county attorney, Reeves's story already spreading. Harold stood in the doorway and listened without interrupting, and when Duke finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then Harold said, "Is it over?" "Not until Sandra has the signatures," Duke said. "But it's close." Harold nodded slowly. He stepped back from the door to let Duke in. "Eli's at school. He doesn't know about today." "How do you want to tell him?" Harold thought about it. "Together," he said. "If that's all right with you. I think he should hear it from both of us." Duke said, "I'll be here." They sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and talked, not about Crow, not about Sandra, not about the county attorney. They talked about Harold's daughter, Sarah, who had made her father laugh with her stubbornness, and her opinions about everything from local politics to the right way to make biscuits. They talked about the sawmill and the men Harold had worked alongside for 30 years, and what it had meant to him to do honest physical work with his hands. Harold talked about his wife, Margaret, who had died 8 years ago, and whom he still thought about every single morning. Duke listened. He didn't fill the silences with his own stories. He just listened. At some point, Harold said, "You never talk about your own people." Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I had a brother, Danny. He died at 25 years ago." Harold said nothing. He waited. "I was the last person who could have helped him," Duke said. "And I didn't. I made a choice and I walked away, and he was dead 11 days later." He looked at his coffee cup. "I've been trying to figure out what to do with that for 25 years. Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You can't fix it." "No, yeah. But you can do this," Harold said. "What you did for us. You can do this." Duke looked at him. "Danny would have wanted that," Harold said, with the quiet certainty of a man who didn't make that kind of statement unless he meant it. "I didn't know him, but I know you. And I know the kind of person who does what you've done here these past 3 weeks. That person had a brother who would have wanted him to live like this." Duke didn't answer. He couldn't. He just sat with it. At 3:15, they heard Eli's footsteps on the porch, that quick, purposeful sound Duke had come to recognize. The door opened. Eli came in, dropped his backpack, and stopped when he saw Duke at the kitchen table. His eyes moved from Duke to Harold and back to Duke. The calculation was instant and visible. This kid read rooms the way Duke read faces, fast and accurate, and all the way down. "Something happened," Eli said. Not a question. Harold said, "Sit down, son." Eli sat. Harold told him quietly and directly the same way he told Duke when they first sat down in the diner. No drama, no softening, no meandering. Eli listened with his hands flat on the table and his face very still, and Duke watched the boy process each piece of information, the way a person processes things when they've been dealing with hard realities for long enough that they don't collapse in the face of them, they just absorb and recalibrate. When Harold finished, Eli was quiet. Then he said, "The eviction is really canceled." "Sandra's getting it in writing," Duke said. "Today or tomorrow." Eli looked down at his hands. His jaw worked for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I thought I was going to have to quit school, to work more hours, I didn't know how we were going to." He stopped, pressed his lips together hard. Harold reached across the table and put his hand over Eli's. Eli looked up. His eyes were bright in a way he was working very hard to control, and Duke recognized that effort because he'd made the same effort for 25 years, and he knew what it cost. He said, "Eli, you are the reason this case held. You kept those letters, you organized them, you put them in a Google Drive like you knew someday someone was going to need them." Eli said, "I just wrote things down." "Yeah," Duke said, "that's exactly what Ruth Hendricks said." Something shifted in Eli's expression. Surprise and then something underneath it that was both younger and older than 13. He said, "Who's Ruth Hendricks?" 73 years old, Meridian Road. "She's going to be okay now too. Because of what you and your grandfather built, that record, those letters, it gave Sandra the template for 4 other cases." Duke looked at the boy steadily. "You didn't just protect your grandfather. You protected 4 other families." Eli stared at him. The brightness in his eyes was losing its battle. Harold squeezed his hand. And Eli, who had scrubbed grocery store floors at midnight for 11 months, who had done math in his head that no 13-year-old should have to do, who had typed letters and kept files and fixed porches with wrong-sized nails and held boards for Big Mike in the cold and said, "I believe you," to a stranger on a phone because he had no better option and the instinct to trust. Anyway, Eli put his head down on the table and cried. Not quietly, not controlled. The real kind, the kind that comes when you have been holding something at bay for so long that when it finally releases, it takes everything else with it. Harold sat with him, didn't speak, just kept his hand over his grandson's and let him go. Duke looked away, looked at the wall, let them have it. When Eli finally lifted his head, his face was blotchy and his eyes were red, and he looked for the first time since Duke had met him exactly his age. He looked at Duke across the table. "You were the first person who asked why," Eli said. Duke said, "Someone should have asked sooner." "But you did." Eli wiped his face with the back of his hand. "That's the part that matters." Sandra called at 4:47. Garrett had sent a draft agreement. She'd reviewed it. It was everything Duke had asked for. All 5 evictions dropped. All 5 rents rolled back and locked for 2 years. All documented repair requests addressed within 30 days, with licensed contractors, all work subject to county inspection. Harold's situation specifically named. Written, signed, done. Duke put the phone on speaker so Harold and Eli could hear her read the key terms. When she finished, Harold said, "Is this real?" Sandra said, "Mr. Bennett, it is completely, legally, absolutely real." Harold sat back in his chair. Eli looked at the ceiling. Duke looked at both of them. And the kitchen of the house at 47 Garner Street, the house with the sealed roof and the working heat and the window Crow had replaced and the subfloor Shepherd had fixed, was so quiet you could hear the baseboard heater clicking steadily in the corner, doing its job, keeping them warm. The story broke wide open that weekend. Reeves's second piece combined with the county attorney's announcement that they were reviewing Crow's rental practices across all 11 properties spread beyond Milford County by Monday morning. Regional papers picked it up, then a national outlet, then the kind of social media spread that happens when a story touches something. People recognize the fear of losing your home, the dignity of an old man doing everything right and nearly losing anyway, the boy who kept records just in case the bikers who showed up with tools instead of violence. Crow resigned from the 2 civic boards he sat on by Wednesday. His attorney issued a statement. Crow himself said nothing public, which Duke thought was probably the smartest decision Philip Garrett had ever gotten his client to make. The county launched an emergency housing fund for senior renters within the month. Sandra Okafor was asked to help design the application process. She called Duke when she heard and said, "You know, when you called me 3 weeks ago, I thought you were just another angry man with a cause." Duke said, "I am an angry man with a cause." "You're something else too," she said. "I haven't decided what yet." Ruth Hendricks called to say her heat was fixed. The Pattersons called to say their lease had been revised. Dorothy Vance sent Harold a card with a picture of a cardinal on it in a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you for fighting. I didn't think anyone would." Harold read that note 3 times and then put it in his manila envelope. Christmas came. Not the December 22nd that Calvin Crowe had planned for them. Not the version where a sheriff's deputy stood on a porch with a notice and a 71-year-old man tried to figure out where to take a 13-year-old boy in the middle of winter. The real Christmas, the one with lights and food and people and noise. Big Mike brought a tree. Crow brought the lights. Shepard, who hadn't been inside a church since 1994, but apparently had opinions about Christmas decorating, brought ornaments. Patty from the diner brought pies, 3 of them different kinds, more than 4 people could reasonably eat, which was exactly the point. Duke came last. He knocked on the door at 47 Garner Street, and when Eli opened it, the boy looked at him with those steady, watchful eyes and said, "You're late." "I had a stop to make," Duke said. He came in, holding something wrapped in brown paper. He set it on the kitchen table and looked at Harold. "I know you didn't ask for this. I know you're going to tell me it's too much. So I'm asking you in advance not to say either of those things." Harold looked at the package, then at Duke. "What is it?" "Open it." Harold unwrapped it carefully, the way he did everything methodically without waste. Inside was a framed photograph. Duke had found it on Patty's phone, taken 6 days ago, when nobody was paying attention. Harold and Duke and Eli at the diner table, the 3 of them eating together. Harold mid-sentence about something, Eli laughing. Duke looking at the old man with an expression Duke hadn't known his face was capable of making until he saw it in the photograph. Harold held it for a long time. Eli looked over his grandfather's shoulder at it. He didn't say anything. He just looked. Then Eli said, "I was going to give you something." He went to his room and came back with a small package wrapped in paper from a grocery bag folded carefully at the corners. He handed it to Duke. Inside was an old photograph frame that Eli had clearly found somewhere and painted over carefully in dark blue. And inside the frame was a piece of paper handwritten in Eli's neat, precise script. Not a photograph, just words. Duke read it. "You were the first person who asked why. You didn't fix us. You just stayed long enough for us to fix ourselves. That's harder. Thank you, Eli." Duke stood in the kitchen of the house at 47 Garner Street on Christmas Eve, holding a piece of paper in a painted frame, and the thing he'd been managing with great discipline for 25 years stopped being manageable. He sat down. Harold put a hand on his shoulder and left it there, steady and sure. The way Harold did everything without fuss, without ceremony, with the simple weight of a person who understood what was needed and provided it. Eli sat across from him. He didn't look away. He didn't make it smaller. He just let Duke feel it. Outside on Garner Street, the first real snowfall of winter had started. Motorcycles were parked in a line along the curb, not 43 this time, just the ones who'd wanted to come, which turned out to be 26, which was more than enough. Big Mike was arguing with Crow about the tree stand. Shepard had somehow burned one of the pie crusts, despite having done nothing that should have resulted in a burned pie crust. Patty was giving him a look that suggested she held strong opinions about this. Inside, Harold put this kettle on. Eli pulled 3 mugs from the cabinet, the good ones, the ones Margaret had picked out 30 years ago that Harold kept at the back because they were too nice for every day. He put them on the table. He said to Duke quietly, "She'd have wanted us to use them." Duke looked at the mugs, at the boy who'd decided at 13, with everything he was carrying, to use the good ones. He said, "Your grandfather's right. She raised you well." Eli smiled, the real kind, the unguarded kind, the kind that had nothing in it except being 13 years old on Christmas Eve in a warm house where the heat worked and the roof didn't leak and there was too much pee, and somewhere outside a group of men in leather vests were arguing about a Christmas tree stand and losing. Harold poured the tea. Duke picked up his mug. And in a dying factory town in northern Montana, in a small house on Garner Street, that had been sealed and warmed and fought for by people who had every reason to walk away and chose not to. 3 people sat down together at a table that had too much food on it for the first time in longer than any of them wanted to count. Some towns die quietly without anyone noticing until it's already done. In some towns, just when you think the last light is going out, find out they were wrong about what they were capable of. Milford County found out, because one man asked why, and that was enough to start everything.